Thanks for tuning in to Cheating Confessions. Don't miss the jaw-dropping conclusion. Kevin stood in the kitchen doorway of my house in Charleston, South Carolina, his eyes locked on mine, and before I could fully grasp what was happening, he leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, quick, almost hesitant, but the shock of it felt like a jolt of electricity. My heart pounded in my chest as I jerked back, the taste of surprise still heavy in the air between us. This was my nephew, the boy I had practically raised after my sister's divorce. He'd always been around, always been part of my life, but never like this. Kevin had just turned 20, barely a man, but there was a maturity in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. His dark hair was slightly tousled from the wind, and he was wearing that familiar worn-out leather jacket his father used to wear. It made him look older, more confident, but it also reminded me of how much he'd been through. Now he was standing there looking at me as though what had just happened wasn't entirely wrong. "What are you doing?" I stammered, my voice unsteady as I backed away from the kitchen table. My hand instinctively went to my mouth, trying to erase the memory of his touch. Kevin didn't answer immediately. His face was unreadable, his blue eyes shadowed with something I couldn't quite identify. Confusion, maybe, regret, but also a hint of longing that sent chills down my spine. He just stood there, frozen, the silence between us growing thicker with every second. I wanted to scream at him, to demand an explanation, but no words came. Nothing in my life had prepared me for this moment. "I don't know," he finally muttered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to." He trailed off, and I wasn't sure if he was trying to apologize or explain, but at that moment, it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. I turned away, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to piece together how we'd gone from a regular family moment to this in just a few seconds. I couldn't understand how or why this had happened, and the worst part was that I couldn't even trust my own reaction. Why hadn't I pushed him away the moment it happened? Why did I stand there frozen instead of pulling back? The questions stormed through my mind, each one hitting harder than the last. The next few hours drifted by in a haze. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head, Kevin's look of intense vulnerability, the silence that followed. It clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake off. We didn't speak afterward. I remained in the kitchen, staring blankly at the cold coffee that sat in front of me, while Kevin retreated to the small guest room he'd been staying in since he moved in 6 months ago. The house felt eerily quiet, far too still, and that silence weighed on me more than any words could. I kept thinking back to how normal things had been just days before. We had always been close, closer than most aunts and nephews, but never like this. I told myself it had to be just a mistake, a lapse in judgment, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. As the sun began to set, Kevin finally re-emerged. He didn't look at me, didn't even acknowledge my presence. He simply drifted through the living room like a ghost, heading straight for the door. I wanted to say something, to call him back, to break this unbearable tension, but the words were trapped in my throat. He grabbed his jacket, muttering something about going for a walk, and left before I could even respond. The second the door clicked shut, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The house, which had once felt warm and welcoming, now felt like a stranger's home, as if it didn't belong to me anymore. I had no idea what to expect when he returned, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. Feeling like I was suffocating, I grabbed my own coat and stepped outside, hoping the fresh air might clear my head. The evening was crisp, with a chill that seeped into my bones, sharpening the reality of what had happened. I wandered down the narrow, quiet streets of Charleston, my footsteps echoing softly on the cobblestones, the occasional car passing by without a sound. My feet carried me toward Liberty Park, a place that had always been a sanctuary for me, a refuge where I could gather my thoughts. The park was nearly empty at this hour, the towering oak trees casting long, eerie shadows on the pathways. I found an old bench tucked away near a fountain, one that overlooked the now leafless trees, and sat down. It was a spot I had often come to whenever I needed to sort out my thoughts, but tonight my mind was a tangled mess, refusing to settle. What had happened back in my kitchen wasn't something I could just brush off or explain away. It was a boundary crossed, a line shattered, and I didn't know if I could ever piece it back together. Part of me wanted to confront Kevin, to make sense of this new reality, but another part of me was terrified of what he might say. As I sat there staring into the darkness, I heard footsteps approaching. My heart leaped into my throat, and for a moment I thought it might be Kevin, somehow finding me out here in Liberty Park, ready to talk. But it was just a jogger, a woman in her mid-30s, passing by without even sparing me a glance. I relaxed slightly, but the tension in my chest remained. I couldn't help but wonder where Kevin had gone. Had he walked to clear his mind as I had, or was he simply trying to run away from what had happened? Maybe he needed space just as much as I did. The questions swirled through my mind, impossible to answer. Why did it happen? What was he thinking? And more importantly, what was I thinking? Why couldn't I shake the feeling that something between us had shifted, and not just because of that kiss? It was as if the foundation of our relationship had cracked, a fracture that had been forming long before tonight, though I had never noticed it. Eventually, the cold began to seep into my skin, and I stood up, stuffing my hands deeper into my coat pockets. I began the slow walk back to the house, my steps heavy and reluctant, every step feeling like a weight dragging me down. As I reached my street, I paused, staring at the two-story Victorian house that had always felt like a safe haven. Now it felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. I stood there for a few moments, my breath forming small clouds in the chilly air, before finally forcing myself to walk up the steps and open the front door. The living room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small lamp in the corner. I half expected to see Kevin sitting on the couch waiting for me, but the room was empty. The quiet was almost suffocating. I walked into the kitchen, my footsteps echoing against the tiles. The same cold coffee cup still sat on the table, untouched since earlier. I stared at it, feeling a strange mix of relief and disappointment wash over me. Kevin still hadn't returned. Maybe that was for the best. I needed more time to think, to figure out what to do next. As I stood there, the reality of it all settled heavily on my shoulders. This wasn't just about the kiss. Not really. It was about the cracks in our relationship that had been forming for years, ever since Kevin moved in with me after his parents split up. We had always been close, closer than most aunts and nephews. But now that closeness felt like a prison, I couldn't escape. I poured myself a glass of water and took a sip, the cool liquid doing little to soothe the tightness in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something. Something I didn't fully understand yet, but something that had the potential to change everything. The fear of that unknown kept me frozen in place. The next morning, I woke up early, my sleep restless and full of fragmented dreams that left me feeling more exhausted than before. The house was deathly quiet, and I couldn't shake the sense of dread that hung in the air. Kevin still wasn't back, and every passing minute without a sign of him made the knot in my stomach tighten further. I wandered downstairs trying to follow my usual morning routine, but everything felt wrong. The smell of coffee, which had always been comforting, now made me feel sick. I poured myself a cup anyway, hoping it would bring some semblance of normalcy, but I couldn't bring myself to drink it. Hours passed, and still no sign of Kevin. I sat in the living room pretending to read a book, but I couldn't focus on the words. Every sound made me jump. Every creak of the house made my heart race, hoping it was the front door opening. But there was nothing, just silence. It wasn't until late afternoon that I finally heard the familiar creak of the front door. I stiffened, my heart pounding as Kevin stepped inside. He looked exhausted, as if he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. But more than that, There was a heaviness to him that I hadn't seen before. "I went for a walk," he muttered, his voice hoarse as he stood in the doorway, not quite looking at me. I nodded, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. I figured. He moved into the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, and leaned against the counter, his posture tense. We stood there in silence, the air between us thick with everything we hadn't said. I knew we couldn't keep avoiding it, but I didn't know how to start. How do you confront something like this? How do you begin to untangle what happened? "So, about yesterday," I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. Kevin froze for a second, his hand gripping the water bottle so tightly I thought it might burst. "I know," he interrupted, his tone sharper than I expected. "I know we need to talk." He put the bottle down and turned to face me, crossing his arms over his chest. There was something in his eyes, a storm of emotions I couldn't quite decipher. "I don't even know what to say," I admitted, my words trembling. It shouldn't have happened. It was wrong. Kevin's jaw tightened, and he ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Yeah, it was. I wasn't thinking. I don't know why I—" He stopped, closing his eyes for a moment as if trying to gather his thoughts. When he opened them again, he looked more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. "I didn't mean to make things weird between us." There it was, the first crack in the wall between us. I could feel the weight of his words, the apology hidden beneath them. But even though he was trying to explain, it didn't make the tension disappear. If anything, it made things even more complicated. "I know," I said softly, trying to match his vulnerability. "But it did make things weird. And now, I don't know how to move forward from this." For the first time, Kevin looked directly at me, his gaze steady yet conflicted. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But I don't want this to change everything between us. I don't want to lose you." His words hit me harder than I'd expected. Lose me? What did that even mean anymore? We weren't just aunt and nephew now. Not after what happened. Something had shifted between us, something I couldn't quite put into words, but it was there, lingering like an invisible thread. "I don't want to lose you either," I finally said, though I wasn't sure how much I believed it. "But we can't pretend like nothing happened. We have to figure out what this means." Kevin nodded, his face troubled but accepting. "You're right." He let out a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry, Laura. I never meant to make things uncomfortable." "I appreciate that," I replied, offering him a small, strained smile. "But I think we both need some space right now to clear our heads." Kevin looked like he wanted to argue, but he simply nodded again. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "I'll go out for a while, give you some space." Without another word, he turned and headed for the door. I watched him leave, feeling the tension in the room finally break, only to be replaced by an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. We had talked, but nothing felt resolved. If anything, it felt like we had barely scratched the surface. That night, Kevin didn't come home. I wasn't sure if I should be worried or relieved. I tried to distract myself, cleaning up around the house, sorting through old photos and letters, even turning on the TV to watch some mindless reality show. But no matter what I did, my thoughts kept drifting back to him. What was he doing? Was he thinking about me, about us? Did he regret what happened, or was he trying to forget it altogether? I didn't know how to answer any of those questions, and that scared me more than anything else. The following morning felt even heavier than the one before. The house was painfully quiet, every creak and groan amplified in the emptiness. I tried to stick to my usual routine, making breakfast, checking my emails, flipping through the pages of a book I'd read a dozen times, but nothing could hold my attention for long. My thoughts kept drifting back to Kevin, to the way he'd looked at me, to the way he'd touched me, and to the way my heart had reacted. By midday, I was ready to crawl out of my own skin. I needed to talk to someone, to hear another voice, to be reminded that there was a world beyond the four walls of my house. I decided to call my friend, Sarah. a woman I'd known since college who always seemed to have a level-headed perspective on things, but even as the phone rang, I realized I couldn't tell her everything. "Hey, Laura, it's been forever!" Sarah's warm voice greeted me, bringing a small smile to my face. "Yeah, it has," I replied, my voice sounding far more strained than I'd intended. I needed someone to talk to. Family stuff, you know?" Sarah didn't pry, but I could sense her concern. "Is it about Kevin? You've mentioned him a lot lately." "Yeah," I admitted. "He's just been acting strange. I'm not sure what to do." She offered a few words of comfort, advice that was gentle and reassuring, but it barely scratched the surface of what I was feeling. I couldn't tell her the truth, couldn't explain the tangled mess of emotions that had taken root inside me. So I thanked her, promised to catch up soon, and hung up, feeling more alone than before. By the time evening arrived, the house felt like it was closing in on me. I grabbed my coat and decided to take another walk, hoping the brisk autumn air would help clear my mind. The streets of Charleston were nearly deserted, most people already tucked away in their warm homes, but the solitude suited me. I found myself wandering back to Harper's Cafe, a small, cozy spot Kevin and I used to visit for late-night snacks and coffee. The cafe was almost empty now, just a couple of students huddled over their laptops, but the familiarity of it brought a sense of comfort. I ordered a cup of tea and took a seat by the window, watching the city lights flicker on one by one as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was in that moment, sitting in a place that held so many memories, that I realized I couldn't just wait for Kevin to come back. I had to confront him, to face whatever this was, no matter how terrifying it might be. The door to my house creaked open just as night settled in, and I felt my heart skip a beat. Kevin stepped inside, looking more exhausted than I'd ever seen him, his eyes rimmed with dark circles. For a moment, he just stood there, as if trying to find the right words. I stayed seated on the couch, unable to move, my fingers nervously gripping the fabric of my sweater. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice rough, as though he hadn't spoken all day. I nodded, gesturing for him to sit down. He hesitated for a moment before lowering himself into the armchair across from me, leaving a gap that felt as wide as an ocean between us. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, until Kevin finally broke it. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know where to start." "Neither do I replied, my words coming out shakier than I'd intended. "But we can't just pretend like nothing happened. We have to face this, whatever it is." Kevin rubbed a hand over his face, his fingers lingering over his eyes, as if he could block out the world for just a moment. "I know," he sighed. I'm scared, Laura. I've never felt this way before, and it's confusing as hell." His confession hung in the air, and I could see how much it had cost him to say those words. Kevin had always been the strong one, the one who kept it together even when everything around him was falling apart. Seeing him so vulnerable now broke something inside me. "I'm scared too," I admitted, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "But we can't keep running from it." Kevin's gaze softened, and for the first time in days, I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice trembling. "We take it one step at a time," I replied. "We talk about it, we figure out what this means, and we don't rush into anything. But we can't keep pretending like everything is fine." He nodded, and I could see the weight of his fear and confusion begin to lift, just a little. "I never wanted to hurt you," he whispered, reaching across the small gap between us to take my hand in his. "I hope you know that." "I know," I said, squeezing his hand gently. "But we need to be honest with ourselves, about what happened, about how we feel, and about what comes next." The tension that had held us both in its grip began to ease, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like we might actually be able to find a way through this. As Kevin and I sat there, holding hands, I knew we had a long road ahead of us, but at least we weren't walking it alone. The next few days passed in a blur. Kevin and I navigated this new territory with cautious steps, avoiding any sudden movements that might shatter the fragile understanding we had begun to build. There were moments when everything felt almost normal again, when we'd share a laugh over breakfast or sit in comfortable silence in the living room. But then, the memory of that night would creep back, and the unspoken words would hang heavy in the air. One evening, as the sun set over Charleston, casting a golden glow across the city, Kevin found me sitting on the back porch staring out into the garden. He hesitated for a moment before joining me, his movements slow, as if he were afraid of breaking whatever fragile peace we'd managed to create. "Can I sit?" he asked, even though he'd already lowered himself onto the step beside me. "Sure," I replied, offering him a small smile. We sat there in silence for a while, listening to the soft chirping of crickets in the bushes and the distant hum of traffic. Finally, Kevin cleared his throat, his fingers nervously picking at the hem of his sleeve. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice barely more than a whisper, "about what happened between us." My heart skipped a beat, and I took a deep breath, bracing myself for whatever was coming next. "And I don't regret it," he admitted, his gaze fixed firmly on the ground. "But I hate that it's made things so complicated between us." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the fear and uncertainty etched into every line of his face. It struck me just how young he still was, despite everything he'd been through. "Kevin," I said softly, "I don't regret it either. But it doesn't change the fact that it was a mistake. We crossed a line." "I know," he whispered, his voice breaking. I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I promised. "But we need to figure out what this means, for both of us." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I want to figure it out. I really do." A sense of relief washed over me, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. "Then we'll take it one day at a time," I said. "We'll talk, we'll be honest, and we'll figure this out together." Kevin reached out, taking my hand in his, and I felt a warmth spread through me that chased away the lingering shadows of doubt. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on me." "I never will," I replied, squeezing his hand gently. "We're in this together." The following week, we started to find a rhythm. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of awkwardness and uncertainty, but we were learning to navigate the new dynamic between us. We took long walks together around Magnolia Gardens, exploring the winding paths and hidden corners of the park. Sometimes we'd talk about our favourite memories, or laugh about something silly that had happened at work, and other times we'd just walk in silence, letting the weight of the past few weeks slowly melt away. One evening, Kevin suggested we go back to Harper's Cafe, the little spot we used to frequent when he first moved in with me. The familiarity of the place was comforting, and as we sat at our usual table sipping coffee and nibbling on pastries, I realised just how far we'd come. It wasn't that everything was suddenly okay, it was more that we'd found a way to move forward, even if we didn't have all the answers yet. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" Kevin asked, a small smile playing on his lips. "Of course," I replied, laughing softly. "You were so excited about the blueberry muffins, you ordered 3 of them." Kevin chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Hey, they're still the best muffins I've ever had." We sat there for hours talking about everything and nothing, until the cafe owner started flicking the lights to signal closing time. As we walked back to the house, the cool night air wrapping around us, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid of what might come next. When we got home, Kevin paused at the front door, his hand resting on the handle. "I know we still have a lot to figure out," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But I'm glad we're doing it together." "Me too," I replied, feeling a warmth spread through me. As we stepped inside, I glanced at the kitchen doorway, the spot where everything had changed, where our lives had shifted in a way we couldn't have predicted. But now, as Kevin and I stood there, side by side, I felt a sense of hope. It wasn't the ending I'd expected, But maybe that was okay. Maybe, just maybe, we were exactly where we were meant to be. Thanks for watching. The next story is ready and just as thrilling. Subscribe to catch new stories every day.